sons are free. There's a learning art and us. That's what's still left for me. That's what's still left for me. The coming hope, the future late, when wrong to right shall go, and ours the terms of courage take to make that future known, to make that future known.
Our story begins after the First World War. That slaughterhouse which shattered respect for kings and emperors and powers. The first victorious socialist revolution in history shook the fabric of the old society. When the war was over, the imperial powers everywhere strove to put the old back as it had been. In Britain, the membership of the trade unions affiliated to the Trade Union Congress dropped by 2 million members. The promises of new houses for the returning heroes were not kept. There were lockouts in mining, in cotton engineering. 6 million workers suffered savage pay cuts. President Harding, head of one of the most corrupt governments in American history, said that we were back to normalcy. But Bernard Shaw saw better. He said there will be no more normal years. The journal's 5 decades have been years of struggle against imperialism and for the widest unity of the working class and progressive forces. Years of open discussion to find the way forward. The founders in 1921 included 2 young Marxists, the editor Rajani Palme Dutt. He is editor still today. I, Robin Page Arnot, as associate editor, am associate editor still today. The first publication in English of the Communist International's call for a united front was in our Labour Monthly. There were no bans on labour unity in those days. Bernard Shaw wrote for us on the dictatorship of the proletariat. Tom Mann wrote on his development from syndicalism to communism. Leonard Woolf and H.N. Brailsford of the liberal socialist New Statesman wrote against imperialism. Norman Angell on the Washington Disarmament Conference. George Lansbury, future leader of the Labour Party, on the Poplar councillors who went to prison rather than raise the rates. The future Lord Citrine, General Secretary of the Trade Union Congress, at his own request, contributed. Harry Pollitt, the young boilermaker, wrote his first article on a new militant policy for the TUC General Council in 1922.
When the first Labour government came in January 1924, of Ramsay MacDonald, I arranged with W.H. Hutchinson, with whom I'd been on friendly terms when he was chairman of the Labour Party in 1919. He later became president of the Amalgamated Engineering Union, to open a series on towards a new policy in trade unions. After it had been published, he came to me in quite a state and said that he'd been hauled over the coals by all his colleagues on the Labour executive for writing this article in our organ. And I expressed all my concern that I wouldn't for the life of me want him to be placed in a difficult position for writing for us, and would suggest the best thing would be if he would arrange with his friend George Hicks of the building workers to write a follow-up article, and then it would not be in isolation. It'd be less easy for them to gun two of them than one. He brightened up, thought it was a splendid idea, and went off at once to get George Hicks. And from that point, I could sit back as editor while they did the work, and in that series, as it developed during the first half of 1924, we had 3 members of the General Council, including its chairman. We had 3 members of the Labour Party executive. We had 4 general secretaries of major unions, and that was the formation of the left wing in the top trade union circles, which in the second half of 1924 became the basis of the British-Soviet Trade Union Committee. Then in the following year, the period leading up to the general strike, Robin Arnot wrote,
when the mine owners who had the support of the Tory government, recently installed after the Red Letter forgery, they planned a big cut in miners' wages. A.J. Cook was the new miners' leader, adored by the miners as no one ever had been before, followed everywhere, and addressing without a mic audiences of 35,000 miners. There had been nothing like Cook. Well, Cook wrote an article in the Labour Monthly headed, "The problem of the hour, is unity possible?" And a special trade union congress was called. It supported the miners. It planned an embargo as answer to the lockout which the owners had declared would take place at the end of the July 1925. And on the day before the lockout, the whole of the owners and mine owners' side and the government side crumpled up, and it was called Red Friday. Everything was withdrawn, and wages were to continue for 9 months, together with a subsidy from the government. Well, during that 9 months, the government prepared, and Churchill, Chancellor of the Exchequer, treated it as a war in which he was preparing, and announced that everything was ready in his speech on December 10th, 1925. And then the General Council of the Trade Union Congress, which had done so well in the previous July, did nothing at all. Nothing whatever. The Labour leaders, at the same time, had subjected the whole movement to bans and proscriptions against the communists. The government, similarly, in order to terrify the movement, arrested 12 communist leaders, whom I was one. And finally, they arrested 128 miners for trial at the assizes in the autumn of 1925. It had no effect. The workers were not terrified. And so at the last moment, it was the action of the workers themselves that withstood the whole of the attack on them at the time of the general strike. Was arrested in Belgium. The journal's editorial notes of the month were actually written from his prison cell. They were called Class Justice. The government forced the general strike at the moment of its own choosing. The workers' response was nationwide, Their morale was high. But the General Council leadership thought of nothing but a pretext to call it off and leave the miners to fight on alone. Within 24 hours of his release from prison some months later, Harry Pollitt wrote for the Labour Monthly, "I cannot do better than to give the thoughts that ran in my mind immediately I heard in prison that the general strike had been called. I thought what a difference there could have been in the whole official direction of the movement if the comrades who took part in the Labour Monthly discussion had then been prepared to organise their forces definitely and fight for the realisation of the new policy on which there was at least a common agreement. When the call came, the workers responded to a man, but the existing leadership failed. And in the moment of failure, there was no difference between the right and the left. This was a complete justification of the whole attitude of the Labour Monthly, and now it is more necessary than ever that it should receive a wide support. The Tories, flushed with their victory, passed a bill to cripple the trade unions. Within a year, the Times was writing, quote, "After years of storm, a certain routine, almost an inertia of peace is being re-established. The state of Europe in 1927 is certainly immeasurably better than it was in 1923. What these words meant was soon shown by the world economic crisis. The British Empire had never been so large. It totaled 14 million square miles, having added 1 million in new territories and mandates after the First World War, and its subjects had never been so poor. Right-wing Labour preached class collaboration in the factories. At the request of foreign bankers, Ramsay MacDonald, whose course the Labour Monthly had analysed and predicted 7 years before, ordered new cuts in wages, in unemployment pay, and in all social welfare benefits. The result was an overwhelming Tory victory and a so-called national government to solve the crisis. The Tories' solution, as always, unemployment. By 1932, over 1/5 of all workers in Britain were unemployed. 26% of all males between 16 and 64. 41% of all males in mining. 49% of all in steel smelting. 38% of all in marine engineering, and 63% of all in shipbuilding and ship repairing, even in cotton textiles, where wages were low because of the high proportion of female labour, 40% in spinning, 22% in weaving were unemployed. No wonder Bernard Shaw, looking back on those days, wrote that after the failure of the Labour Party to fulfill the hope of its founders, quote, "The Labour Monthly stepped in and kept the red flag flying, while the Labour Party was waving a tattered old Union Jack." New generations of contributors rallied to the Labour Monthly. Veterans like William Gallagher, youth like John Gollan from the universities, Maurice Dobb, J.B.S. Haldane, Professor J.D. Bernal. From Europe, Clara Zetkin, Jürgen Kuczynski, Maurice Thorez, Romain Rolland, Henri Barbusse, Eugene Varga, and Ilya Ehrenburg. On the liberation struggle, Gandhi, Nehru, Nkrumah, Azikiwe. Despite repeated bans imposed by the British government's colonial office, the Labour Monthly circulated in more than 30 countries. Sanzo Nosaka, for more than 30 years chairman of the Communist Party of Japan, first contributed to the Labour Monthly in 1921 and is still writing for it today. The first article in the Labour Monthly exposing Hitler's movement was 10 months before his Munich putsch, as far back as January 1923. Now, as reactions turned increasingly to support fascism, Labour Monthly printed numerous contributions from those in the labour movement who supported the United Front in Britain and the Peace Front to prevent war. Aneurin Bevan, Stafford Cripps, G.D.H. Cole, Harold Lasky, Connie Ziliakis, D.N. Britt.
That is, I gave the warning, not suddenly, but by a continuous progression since 1931. We are entering into war. Beginning of Hitler's drive of expansion, when the Tory government and the official labour movement were acquiescing in the occupation of the Rhineland and the policy of appeasement, I wrote, "It is the national government and the Bank of England that are the secret base of support for the Hitler-Schacht government."
My feelings and impressions of all that I have seen, those I shall have to take longer time to digest and to get together, because I've seen so much in a very short time. I shall hope to have the opportunity of seeing more. It's a wonderful tribute to those who have organized it.
Then we came to 1938, the period leading up to Munich.
Yesterday afternoon, I had a long talk with Herr Hitler. It was a frank talk, but it was a friendly one.
All right. Yeah.
as the flames rise higher, the real role of the British national government in the guise of pouring oil on troubled waters, in reality pouring oil on the flames, stands out ever sharper and clearer in the chain of events leading to a new world war. Every link in the chain leads back to the national government.
Solve that problem peacefully, because on that turns the peace of Europe in our time.
So there came Munich. Britain, I wrote, betrayed the dikes of peace at Munich. That is the history of 1938 in a nutshell. The hour of awakening. For 6 years, Britain has fostered its lion cub Hitler in the hope of having a fine, hefty lion to let loose on the Soviet Union. The lion has now grown up, and the most critical point of British policy is here: how to ensure that the lion will do its duty and not prefer the soft flesh of its keeper.
The Chamberlain government had refused the peace front alliance of East and West that could have prevented war. Its official War Aims pamphlet complained only that Hitler had broken his promise to attack the USSR. When eventually Hitler engulfed Europe and Britain, in Churchill's phrase, stood alone, the responsibility was clear. The people asked for truth. A first Labour Monthly conference on the war was held. The net sail rose. September 39, January 40, December 40, May 1941. Then came paper rationing. Journals were limited to 1/6 of previous paper weights. By printing on thin paper with a new layout, the circulation went up as the weight went down. In October 1940, Labour Monthly published a manifesto calling for a People's Convention. The convention took place in January 41, with massive participation from far and wide, including Indira Gandhi, now Prime Minister of India. The popular press gave the warning: the people are beginning to turn to the Communist Party. The right-wing Labour press echoed. The enthusiasm and assent put even the Labour Party at a disadvantage. Artists and other personalities who took part in the convention were blacklisted by the BBC. D.N. Pritt was expelled from the Labour Party for opposing anti-Soviet hysteria. He became a valued member of the Labour Monthly Board. The Daily Worker was banned by Herbert Morrison, Labour Home Secretary in the new government. June 1941. 6 months later, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. What had begun as phony war became a world struggle against fascism. Labour Monthly sought to build up unity against the common enemy. One issue was specially dedicated to British-Soviet cooperation. The leaders pledged cooperation after victory. Even Churchill's name could not save the Tories at the general election which followed victory. The electors remembered the past. Labour Monthly proclaimed, "Victory of democracy in Europe must sound the knell for Tory reaction in Britain."
Chairman and comrades, I have this evening accepted His Majesty's commission to form...
But, as Professor Blackett said, the deification of the atomic bomb was not so much the last military act of the Second World War as the first act of the diplomatic Cold War with Russia. Churchill gave the signal at Fulton, USA, with the new American president at his side. Labour obeyed. Money for the arms race. Gone were the hopes of winning the peace. Socialism, a better world. Disappointed, disillusioned, the electors in 1951 turned back to the Tories. Not for 13 years did they give Labour another chance. Once more, right-wing Labour succumbed. They obeyed big business at home and the American presidents abroad. Again, this policy proved fatal.
To govern is to serve.
Britain today has one of the worst, most heartless and ruthless Tory governments in history. A government for the rich. The stock exchange share values were up millions in the week after Budget Day. The labour exchanges, registered unemployed, were around the million mark, plus school leavers and unregistered, half as much again. A government against the poor. A government against the trade unions. Against the old and infirm. Against the young. A government dragging us into the common market regardless of cost to unite European big business and keep alive the split of West against East. But Dutt can say, with truth,
the need of unity of the world socialist camp, of the international working class movement, and of all the forces of national liberation and democratic progress is greater than ever in the present dangerous world situation. Equally, in Britain, the paramount need is the strengthening of working class and democratic unity to defeat the offensive of Tory reaction and prepare the conditions for the victory of the working class and socialism in the oldest country of capitalism.
Don't take part, take thought, unite, take part. There's food is broken, and life shall come to flower. And over the fence of fear, the courage holds. The truth on the basket and on.
Sweep on for the ring,
answered, the voice of truth has spoken. Life springs in the country, the cities are flooding with light, for the people are sweeping on the oppressors in flight. Now take heart, take thought, unite, take part.